Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCS round number 3 overview and analysis video here in the LCS Championships, the summer split playoffs, whatever you want to call it. We are back here to cover this past weekend of LCS action. We've got 3 best of 5s to cover in today's video, so it is going to be a bit of a longer one. I don't want to make this intro crazy long. If you want to know my thoughts on the games that have happened up until this point in the playoffs, check out the videos up in the iCard. Not only are those videos going to be up there, but of course the LCS playlist for the entirety of the summer split is going to be up there if you want to know my thoughts on how we got here in the regular season, or if you want to see my playoff primer. All of those videos are of course going to be linked in the iCard, but today we've got quite a few things to cover. Not only are we going to know our 3 teams that are going to be representing the LCS at Worlds, because we will be ending with top 3 by the end of this video, but that means we're going to know who is officially eliminated, as well as who is officially in the finals. We have winners finals to cover in today's video as well, so quite a bit to go over. Again, I don't want to waste you guys' time too much, so let's get right into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in all 3 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Like I said, we will know our 3 teams representing the LCS at Worlds by the end of this video. We will definitely talk about that, as well as the upcoming matchups, the semifinals, and of course, the finals here for the LCS Championship. A lot to go over at the end, but most of today will be spent talking about the 3 series we got this past weekend. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first matchup that we have here is our lower bracket round number 2 matchup. This is kind of a series to determine who even has a chance to play for a shot at Worlds. One of these teams will be eliminated in 5th place. The other will, of course, move on to take on Cloud9 and try to get themselves into the World Championships, but both, I think, are fighting uphill battles. Both have interesting, features and things about the teams, though. It's the number 5 seeded 100 Thieves taking on the number 4 seeded Dignitas. This is, of course, a rematch from round number 1 from the upper bracket, where 100 Thieves, quite frankly, dismantled Dignitas. That series wasn't particularly close. 100 Thieves very much had their number. They were better in all 3 games and ended up obliterating Dignitas down into the lower bracket. 100 Thieves, of course, got a pretty rough draw in round 2 with Team Liquid just because of the way that the bracket ends up working out, and so they meet Dignitas down here as they were the lower seed, and still, I think 100 Thieves have to be considered pretty big favorites for this series, if only because of the outcome the last time these 2 teams played. I know in my bracket, when I did my playoff predictions, when I did my full bracket prediction in the primer, I talked a bit about this matchup quite extensively because I had them facing off twice in the bracket. I had 100 Thieves winning the first time and Dignitas winning the second time. I thought Dig was one of those teams that would just get more confident and a little bit more consistent as the tournament went along. We'll see if that happens. They didn't quite dismantle Energy in the way that I kind of expected them to. I thought that series was going to be very Dignitas favored, but it actually took them quite a bit to be able to take down Energy, and they honestly weren't the cleanest team in the entire world, and so that's not the kind of confidence and momentum I thought they were going to generate going into a series like this. I think because of that, and because 100 Thieves did look so good in their first matchups, they are going to be going into this as the favorites, but playstyle-wise, they are still very similar, just like I talked about in round number 1. Both of these teams really want to run through the middle of the map. You have players like Quid and Jensen that have been so integral towards their team's success over the course of this year, and it's really going to be up to which one of those players can get further ahead in a lot of these games. If Quid is able to completely take over, especially if he's able to get an early game lead, he's going to be able to snowball games out of control to the point where Dignitas just can't answer. But if Dig actually do a good job of making sure Jensen feels comfortable going into the late game, that's where they found all of their advantages in the summer split themselves. That's where they were able to win a lot of their series. There still are concerns for both teams. For Dignitas, the top side of the map is very much still a question mark. Licorice was pretty good in that series against Energy, but Spica continues to kind of underperform, and especially going into a team like 100 Thieves that wants to try to out-macro you or outplay you in the mid-game, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult for Dignitas to generate pressure. In matchups like that, Spica is going to need to be on his A game here today if they want to win. And like I said, Licorice is also going to need to step up and just kind of be the better top laner, which he very much was not the first time these 2 teams played. But 100 Thieves have their own set of weaknesses on the top side of the map. I think River has had a pretty weak split, all things considered. I generally just don't think he's played all that well leading into a series like this, certainly in comparison to the highs that he had in spring and last year on Golden Guardians. This reminds me a lot more of summer of 2022 when he was, playing half for Dig, half for Golden Guardians. He got traded halfway through the split. It really reminds me of that, where he He's not like a bad player. He's not completely invisible. He's not completely running it for the team. He's just not particularly useful right now towards getting 100 Thieves leads. It's really been Quid winning isolated in the mid lane and Tomo and Ayla being a big upgrade in the bot lane. And then you look at someone like Sniper. He's coming off of one of the worst best of fives that anyone has played in the LCS all year long. He got obliterated by Impact. That 1v1 matchup was so anti-100 Thieves that you have to hope that he can mentally bounce back and show up in this series in the same way that he did the first time these two teams played against each other. But you know, I feel more confident in 100 Thieves in that regard. I think Sniper is a player that I believe it won't get, like, ridiculously mentally tilted. I think River is the kind of player that has shown in the past that he is more than capable of stepping up when it matters the most, and Tomo and Ayla have been a huge upgrade here to the bot lane. As much as I like Sven, I really don't know if the consistency of Sven is enough to match the highs of Tomo, at least at the current moment. Tomo is very much playing with something to prove, and, you know, as again, Sven is very, very good, and you know what you're going to get out of him from a game-to-game basis, but I don't necessarily think that that's inherently just an advantage for Dignitas. And so 100 Thieves have a lot of advantages around the map. That's why I'm projecting that they win this series, but we'll see if I end up being correct on that, because now it is time to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Dignitas. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this was exactly what they needed here in game number 1. They needed the kind of win where they could just come out and be the better team, where the game could go a little bit slower in the early game, where you can draft things like Nasus and Senna and Amumu and just play for these 5v5 team fights, try to get into these close quarter situations, and then end up just having more stats at the end of the game. I really don't love 100 Thieves draft. I think it's way too risky. I don't really think it's particularly good in the current meta. Things like Nocturne, they're just not really all that valuable at the current moment. They take way too long to get online, and what's Nocturne going to do to Nasus in the late game? Like, he can't burst him down, he can't assassinate him, and Nasus is just going to walk up and kill him with 1 Q. And so, don't really love the Nocturne pick here. I don't think the Sylas was particularly good as well. I understand the idea of potentially trying to steal things like the Amumu ultimate. Like, I can generally see a world in which that is very valuable for 100 Thieves, of course, but it just didn't really end up working out that way. Dignitas just had more pressure in the back half of this game, and they certainly executed better. Player of the game could go to one of 2 players. Maybe controversially, I'm actually going to give it to Sven in the bot lane. I think a lot of people are going to give this to Jensen, and I understand, like, the Nasus was really good in his role, but blind picking Nasus is still something that I'm pretty against, and generally speaking, I'm pretty against a lot of this Dignitas draft. I don't think Amumu is one of those picks that I think is nearly as strong as NA, you know, is making it out to be. I think this is one of those picks that if teams are relying on it going into, like, international tournaments, they're going to get mega exposed on it. I think Nasus is certainly something that, while we have seen mid lane Nasus in a lot of the other regions, it's been very unsuccessful in a lot of the other regions, and the games that it does work, oftentimes it feels like ignorance from the other team and just kind of allowing it to work rather than the champion itself doing a lot of things. And that's how I felt in this game, where it wasn't like Jensen dominating this game and playing super well in the mid game to get himself into a position where he can carry. It was really just, okay, 100 Thieves don't have a way to stop the big dog from walking up and pressing Q. And like eventually that's going to start being a problem, even if Jensen was pretty behind for a majority of this game. And so, you know, I just didn't feel like Nasus deserved player of the game in this one, but I definitely think Sven did. The way he played out the back half of this game, a lot of the team fights here on the Ezreal, basically perfection. I mean, oftentimes we can just undersell how good Sven is. I basically did it in the preview, in the, you know, the beginning part of this series, and I don't want to do that. I don't want it to come across like I don't think Sven is like an upper tier AD carry in North America. I think this role has gotten significantly better in summer. A lot of players have upgraded themselves, and I think Tomo getting back into the league has certainly made like the depth of the league better at the position, but Sven is very much in a conversation to be in that upper tier of AD carries when he gets into a position where he can just play super consistently safe, and, you know, where he is just kind of the Teddy or the Patrick or that style of player. He executes in that role better than anybody else in North America, and you just feel very comfortable having him. He just doesn't really have bad games. You feel super consistent with him, even if he's not the most aggressive player in the entire universe. I think that kind of style works very well in the ecosystem of North America, where some of these games are a little bit more, you know, chaotic chaotic and wild. Having a player you can lock in and lock down in terms of the performances you know you're getting, I think is very valuable. Licorice I thought was pretty interesting on the Wukong here. I was very surprised to see R5 Wukong. Wasn't entirely shocked to see the Nasus flexed mid. That's kind of the priority right now in terms of where he has been played internationally. I imagine 100 Thieves was anticipating this matchup as well with the Sylas in the mid lane, but Wukong top is certainly not what I thought here. They're really indexing entirely into the 5v5, and for the most part, it ended up working out. I thought Licorice was pretty good in this game. He was definitely better in lane than I was anticipating, just straight up better in the 1v1 into Sniper, and that felt more like player diff than it did like champion diff, but, you know, I thought Licorice was pretty good. Spica misclicked his R. That's the thing you're going to remember him for this game, but he continues to be in love with Amumu. This was the case last year on FlyQuest as well. This is just a champion that he clearly has a gigantic affinity for. I don't agree with it. You know, we're going to talk about it more in this video. Amumu was very highly prioritized over the course of this weekend. I just don't really see it. I get the ultimate's really good. I just don't think he does anything else, but, you know, I digress. It worked in this game. Isles was fine on the Senna. This is another pick that I think should be prioritized more, but for 100 Thieves on the other side, you just didn't really play to your own win conditions. You don't really have a way to beat Nasus in the back half of this game. You don't have any way to shred or to kind of tear him down bit by bit. He's just going to heal through all of your, quite frankly, lackluster damage in this comp when you're trying to compound like Nocturne, Sylas, and Ziggs as your primary carries, going into something that heals as much as a Nocturne with a Senna will. It's just going to be really difficult for you to ever break through that, and I think they found that out the hard way. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Tomo in the bot lane. I just didn't feel like the Ziggs was all that valuable in this game. This wasn't quite one of those games where I'm like, you never utilize Ziggs in the way that he should be utilized. Like, they did try to move around the map and take every tower in the game. He just wasn't really all that useful in doing anything else after that, and I think that was a bit of a problem. I think generally the champions of Nocturne and Sylas let down the good play of River and Quid. They did a good job of getting ahead. They just couldn't actually do anything with it because the champions are largely useless in this matchup. And then, you know, Sniper kind of got obliterated on the top side of the map in laning phase. I think he did a lot better towards the back half of the game, but, you know, if he's going to carry over some of that bad form he had from the Team Liquid series, that's going to be very bad for 100 Thieves moving forward. So, nice win for Dignitas. Very important for them to pick up this game 1. But if they can now pick up game 2, if they can do what 100 Thieves did to them in round number 1 and really put them on the back foot, that is a great place for Dignitas to be sitting. I'm sure 100 Thieves want to tie up the series, though. Going down 0-2, having to win 3 in a row in the playoffs is just never an enviable task against anybody, regardless of who you are and who you're playing against. And so, a big game number 2, but only one team can take the victory. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 2 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we definitely have a lot more of a back and forth on our hands than maybe we anticipated after game number 1. Really nice stuff here from 100T, just getting back to the game plan, really understanding where a lot of your power lies as a team, what you're good at, and more specifically, what Dignitas is bad at. Just pressure them out of a lot of these situations. If they're going to play Maokai Corki, which is probably the strongest mid-jungle in the game, at least in a lot of teams' opinions at the current moment, then play Yone, play, you know, Amumu if you really have to, play something like a Misfortune, play these things that can create their own pressure throughout multiple sections of the game that aren't entirely reliant on getting to certain breakpoints in order to be good, and then you can really pressure Dignitas out of a lot of these circumstances. That's exactly what 100 Thieves ended up doing, and I think they executed it well. Player of the game has to go to Quid. This was a phenomenal game from him on the Yone. He continues to be the driving force basically every single time this team wins. It is very rare for this team to be dominant and like actively come out and like win games and have Quid not be somebody that you're looking at first in a lot of those games. That's simply how good he has been for 100 Thieves. I think that it's pretty clear at this point that he is at worst like a top 2 mid laner in North America, that it's not even really all that debatable for me. It just really depends on how high you view guys like APA or how high you view guys like Jojo Pune still in terms of your rankings. I think Quid has an argument that he's number 1, like in terms of raw performance, in terms of like carry ability that he has shown over the past year. I don't know if anybody has put their team on their back quite like Quid, and that's not to take away from 100 Thieves members. It's just the direction that this team likes to go in. They like to play through him individually. Nobody has been asked to carry as much as Quid on this team, and so I've just been incredibly impressed. When this guy wins, he wins so hard, and he very rarely loses. Even on the Sylas game in game 1, I was criticizing the champion. I wasn't criticizing the gameplay. He played really well, and he was really useful in that game. He just didn't have a lot to do, and so having this Yone game in game 2, I think was very very encouraging. Ayla also had a phenomenal game on the Rel. Really excited to see Ayla start performing. I think Tomo coming in really affected this bot lane 2v2. Ayla was always a player that was a lot more focused on like the team fighting. He was never somebody that was dominating the 2v2 in Academy, even when he was paired up with Yon and when they were like really, really good. He was kind of a mid-game, late-game kind of player, and so to get him into this situation now where you have an AD carry that does like to fight a lot 2v2 early, that does like to play aggressive and to establish pressure, Ayla's really had to step up and kind of match that tempo, and he has so far. His mid games have continued to be excellent, but I've always been a really big fan of Ayla and his game. I've for a while said that he is like better than Busio. He just hasn't had the same opportunities. I'm not sure if I'll stand on that until I die or anything like that, but certainly Ayla is a player that is a lot better than maybe he gets the reputation of being. Tomo was much better here in game 2 on the MF. River playing Amumu. This champion continues to be high prio here in NA. He was good on this. This was better than Spica's Amumu game for sure. And Sniper was fine in the top lane, which is all he really has to be. He just has to not lose. And 100 Thieves, again, just play through the middle of the map and are able to get a big enough lead to just end it very cleanly. Good stuff from them. And then for Dig, a lot of their stuff just falls apart if they go into the late game not feeling comfortable. And I know that that's a very obvious thing to say. We say that about a lot of the teams in the world, but specifically for a team like Dig, they just don't really have like secondary plans. They're not very flexible in terms of their game plan, and especially someone like Jensen, who is going to get dud of the game. He really needs to be enabled in the mid game to be able to get to these breakpoints and for him to carry. This is one of the weaker Corki games that we've watched in quite a while, and Jensen's had quite a few bad performances over the course of these playoffs. He was super integral towards Dignitas' success in the regular season, but along with that came a couple of bad games, and I think really the takeaway for me from this Dignitas season has been that either Jensen gets really far ahead for them and they're able to actively play through him and win a lot of these late game fights, or you just have to hope and pray that Sven is strong enough to be able to win the game on his own, because you're really not getting a ton out of anybody else on this team, and certainly this team doesn't feel comfortable playing through anybody else, which has become abundantly apparent as you've watched more and more games. Jensen just was horrible in this one. I'm not even blaming the team for this. He just had a really bad Corki game. He played this one really poorly. Quid outplayed him basically in every aspect of the game and got super fed and just kind of ran over him. You can't really get away with this and still win the game in the mid lane right now, especially on a champion like Corki. That should be pretty inevitable. That really wasn't the case here. So Jensen's got to be better. I think you're looking for better performances out of Sven as well. Again, he's kind of the consistency, the stability of this team, and even he had a pretty bad game here on the Kalista, just never really had prio and pressure. Ayla was by far the best player in the bot lane, and it really shut down the early 2v2 that Dignitas invested a lot into in draft. I mean, this Kalista Senna is supposed to win. It's supposed to be able to pressure out the MF. That's why you pick it on R3. It just really didn't end up working out that way, and I think that was a problem. And like we said, when Jensen and Sven aren't doing well, this team really has no prospects of winning games. Licorice has not really been a carry. Spica on the Maokai has certainly not been anything. Isles, you're not asking him to carry on the Senna, but overall for Dig, like, they have to be better in the middle of the map. That's really what's going to determine this series. As we stated in the preview, Quid was better in game 2 and 100 Thieves won. The 100 Thieves had no mid-jungle pressure because of their champions in game 1, and so they lost. Like, it really is that simple. It's whoever is able to generate that pressure and that prio. But now the series is tied up at 1 apiece. You guys know I do believe that game 3 is the most important game when tied up at 1 apiece, because taking control and not having to win both of the final 2 games is a huge advantage heading into the back half, but only one of these teams is going to get that advantage. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Dignitas. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and they are now 1 game away from moving themselves into the top 4 and getting their revenge on 100 Thieves for sending them down into the lower bracket to begin with. A great game 3 from them. This was much cleaner. This is a very clear example of everything we've been talking about in terms of the preview between these two teams, and so honestly, I don't think there is a ton that I want to spend time on when it comes to this game, because it really just was the execution of the game plan. It was them understanding where exactly they wanted to put their pressure, how to get it there, and then having champions that could make the most of it once they did actually get it there. And to 100 Thieves, like, this was a horrible game. There is a lot more to talk about on their side than on the Dignitas side, in my opinion, but player of the game is pretty obviously going to go to Jensen. In the mid lane, we were just complaining about him and talking about how he just had the worst Corki game I've seen in quite a while. Now he goes to the Smolder, something that is even more inevitable than something like Corki, and ends up getting very fed in the mid game, ends up getting a lot of stacks, and just ends up taking over. Like, it makes it very, very simple. Simplify the process. If you are any team in the LCS, any team in North America, simplify the process. Draft things like Smolder, draft things like Cassante, even things like Senna, things that are just so generally useful that regardless of how the game state ends up going, you've put yourself in a position where you're going to be valuable. And if the enemy team makes a misstep, or multiple missteps as they did in this game, then the game is over, because the missteps in this case were getting Smolder very ahead. Like, every single one of the mistakes that 100 Thieves ended up making ended up giving more and more gold over to a champion that can't fail with gold in the end. And so Jensen looked a lot better. I'm not going to entirely say it was him individually as a player that like got this, but at the end of the day, he was the one who took over the game, so he should be getting the praise for it. I also want to shout out Licorice, who has actually been pretty good through the first couple games of this series. I'm saying that like I'm surprised. I'm not surprised. I think Sniper has really kind of been on a downward trajectory so far in the playoffs. He was really good in their first series, got obliterated by Team Liquid, and has not really carried over a ton of confidence into this series. It's really not been good. Licorice has definitely been the better of these two top laners through the beginning part of this series. The Senna continues to be a no-brainer. As long as they're willing to give it over, this thing is just so consistent. It really offers so many different things. If you want to play for something like the Amumu Engage like combo at the end of the game, if you don't need that Engager coming out of the support position, then something like Senna to just enable, Cassante to never die, or Smolder to just play super aggro, it just makes things a lot easier for a lot of your other carries. I really like Senna in this meta. Sven was really good on the Kalista as well. I understand the idea of going back to this, even though it didn't work out in game 2, because on paper, this should be a good matchup for Dignitas, and it definitely worked out a lot better here in game number 3. I'm still a little up in the air about the Amumu generally, but River had such a horrible game that Spica was able to do basically anything he wanted throughout this entire game, and that was get the Smolder ahead. So credit to Dig, they understood their win condition and they played for it. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, this was a horrendously bad game. The top side of the map completely imploded, and I'm gonna be pretty harsh on this game number 3 because there's really not any reason not to be. This was just really poorly played. This was not a playoff level performance from 2 of the 5 players on this team. It's gonna start with my dud of the game being Sniper in the top lane. I don't know what's going on with him. I think Impact might have broken him in that series against Team Liquid because he was awful here. I mean, this was the most useless Olaf I've ever seen, and that's kind of an accomplishment. There are a lot of games and a lot of comps where Olaf is just kind of really hard to execute on. I don't even think this is necessarily one of those games. I think that there are quite a bit of, drafts that just come down to, oh, Olaf can't actually stay and stick onto the carries, and there's really no way for him to be useful, but him running it down in the mid game and him being so useless in the late game was almost entirely a player diff, in my opinion, and that's why Sniper is getting my dud of the game, but that does not absolve River of having truly a horrendous performance, and quite frankly, I've been incredibly disappointed with River. I know people are still high on him because he's, a name value, and LCS in particular, they love name value. They love players that they recognize. That's just generally how LCS fans like to operate. Once you generate your name and say like, hey, I'm a good player, now all of a sudden you are a good player forever. And so I don't think people have noticed as much that River was not nearly as good in summer as he was in spring, that he was genuinely, in my opinion, for most of this year, a pretty clear bottom 4, bottom 3 jungler in the LCS. Like, there were just a lot of games that he was not particularly good in, and this performance was atrocious. I mean, he was constantly diving in only to die instantly. He gave so much gold over to Dignitas and to Jensen and to Sven and to Licorice, and I just don't understand the point. Like, I don't understand the idea behind the decisions that he was making. It actively ran it down for 100 Thieves. I think everybody else was generally fine. Ayla was maybe not perfect here, but Quid, Tomo, I didn't really have a huge issue in how they played the game, but how much is there to do when the top side of your map runs down the game as much as they did? This was impossible to win for 100 Thieves with how they played, and now their back is up against the wall. They are 1 game away from being eliminated from this tournament. If they do not win game number 4, they are done. Their year is over, but they do have the chance to win this and tie it up and send us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. Anything can happen in a game 5. All they need to do is get there, but will they be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 4 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5 in the lower bracket. Lower bracket's turning out to be a pretty fun little excursion for quite a few of these teams in this gauntlet style format. You've obviously got a lot on the line, no more extra lives for these teams, and they are playing like their lives are on the line in this series. It's been a lot of fun to watch. These two teams have definitely both shown up today, and honestly, I thought Dignitas played relatively well in this game. I just think 100 Thieves had the best player on the Rift, and that's the unfortunate part, is that you have to kind of take into account, like, as well as we play as a unit, if we don't have that X-Factor superstar, which right now Dignitas just don't have, and 100 Thieves do have that, then that might be a bit of a problem, even with some players on 100 Thieves not exactly playing all that perfect. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Quid. He's a superstar. I mean, at this point, there's nothing else left for me to believe when it comes to him. This is the kind of guy that can carry a team to being the best in the league. If you put the right level of talent around him, which, you know, they may or may not have right now, then this team could genuinely be a threat, not only to make worlds, but like an LCS level threat. Quid is the kind of player that can win MVP regularly in this league, and it's been really fun to watch his development and his growth. I was a Quid non-believer, honestly, coming out of the Challengers League. Again, as somebody who watches a lot of the Challengers League, I didn't see it in Quid. I thought he was somebody who needed to be spoon-fed a lot of resources in order to succeed. He was basically 1v9ing every game on Gen G Challengers purely because they had nobody else that could play at an even remotely decent level, and Quid was kind of getting every resource because of that. It was very difficult to try to evaluate him as a player, and then he comes over here to NA, and he has to play with Doublelift, and he has to play with Closer, and these are some very, I guess, resource-heavy players in their own right. When Doublelift is on a team, you're playing through bot lane, which means Quid kind of had to go out of his comfort zone and out of the style that he had gotten very accustomed to, and it didn't work out. He was not very good in his rookie year, but here, year number 2 here, 400 Thieves, he has been nothing but exceptional. The MVP and the deserving one, in my opinion, in the spring split, and then another guy who just stepped up and was an all-pro for a team that was struggling for a lot of this split here in the summer split. So nothing else left to say. This guy's ridiculous on Yone. He's good on marksman. He's good on everything. When you allow him to take over games, he can do it. He can do it on mages, obviously. I feel like that's weird that that's the last one I said for mid laner, but it is what it is in the current meta. Quid's just awesome, and I can't praise this guy enough. Truly, the development and the progress that he has made as a player is astounding. I think the rest of this team was okay as well. Ayla had another really good game here on the Nautilus. He has definitely been the better support in this series. River continues to look good. Amumu is 4-0 to start off this series. Just very funny considering that, you know, I said I didn't like the champion. I know results-based analysis would lead you to believe that maybe I should change my mind. I haven't really changed my mind. I think that there are a lot of champions that do what Amumu does. I'm still shocked that Sejuani is not being prioritized really at all in any of these games, but, you know, I'm sure these teams have practiced a lot of Amumu, and he's much easier to execute if you are playing from ahead, and so I do kind of understand it. However, dud of the game is actually going to stay on the 100 Thieves side. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Sniper once again in the top lane. There's just not really a lot to say. He has been really bad in this series, and 100 Thieves is really on the back foot. I'm not going to say entirely because of him, but there is a lot that has gone wrong because Sniper has just not been consistent. This Camille pick has not really worked for anybody. It's been a massive bait basically everywhere in the world. We've seen good teams pick up this champion and completely run it down. We've seen bad teams attempt to turn their fortunes around and have it not work. I'm not a Camille believer in terms of the results that I've seen in pro. I think from a baseline perspective, this champion can work, but it seems to be much too aggressive for a meta that relies so much on mid and bot lane pressure. You can't put the resources into Camille that you need to in order to make her, you know, as good as you would want her to be. And Sniper, unfortunately, was just way too aggressive. I mean, every single fight, he was diving in head first. He was constantly skirmishing, just playing like an absolute madman for basically the entire game, and it really hurt 100 Thieves for a lot of sections. They could have lost the series based off of this game, and, you know, they're kind of lucky that they didn't, but Sniper has to turn this around. I mean, this is starting to get concerning. Again, he was awful last series. He's not been good this series. He's got to start stepping it up. They really need him to be good, and it's just not been there over the past couple of games, but Quid has been so good, it honestly doesn't matter what else is happening on the team right now. He is good enough to carry them. And then for Dig, this was a fine game, but they just didn't have the best player on the Rift. Again, that's just kind of what it comes down to. I do feel bad for Licorice. I think he is having a phenomenal series here. Sniper is really struggling, and Licorice is taking full advantage of that. He has been really, really good through the first 4 games, just as he was against NRG. It's really nice to see him step up when it matters the most, even if he hasn't exactly been great for this team throughout the entirety of the year. I don't think Jensen or Sven or Isles were really all that bad. Maybe Sven was a little bit too far forward, but he was also targeted a lot. Isles was fine. Jensen was fine on the Hui in this game. But unfortunately, Spica just missing a couple 50-50 smites. Why are we going for 50-50 smites in the first place? I really don't know. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. It feels like you have a lot of good objective control here that you just didn't really utilize. But at the end of the day, that's what the game came down to, and Spica ended up losing that. I know people are really going to rag on him, but I think outside of that, his game was generally fine. It certainly wasn't perfect, but that's a pretty big miss, especially in a game that could have closed out the series. We'll see if that comes back to bite Dignitas and see if that comes back to bite Spica, because we're heading into the Silver Scrapes game number 5, the final game of this series. One of these teams will move on to take on Cloud9 later on in the video, and the loser will have their 2024 ended. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be moving on for a chance to play their way into the World Championships. This team of ostensibly just all rookies and all unproven players outside of River. Even Quid had only had one split at the top level before this. Ayla had obviously had some time, but if you're considering Ayla a veteran, that's insane. You've got this ridiculously young experimental North American roster that now gets a chance to play their way into top 3. Of course, it's not quite done yet. They haven't confirmed anything, but you've got to be very excited at the development that they have made, and unfortunately, it comes at the expense of Dignitas, a team that I think a lot of people were cheering for. A lot of the community seemed to really rally behind a lot of veterans that I think are very likable, very high profile names that just couldn't quite get it done. As Sven said it best at the end of this series, they never really found their synergy. They never really found a way to consistently play the game. It felt like Jensen getting ahead was really their only win condition in a lot of instances, and when that didn't happen, they just were never really able to find something else, even if players like Sven and like Licorice in this series were pretty solid. But it's unfortunate because this might be the last we ever see of Dignitas in the LCS. Obviously, we don't know for sure or anything like that, but there are certainly enough rumors going around to believe that it could potentially be on the table. But before we jump into talking about Dig, let's talk about 100 Thieves, player of the game and player of the series. Come on, man, it's a no-brainer. It's going to Quid. This guy is absurd. Yone, Yasuo, all 3 of those games end up being unstoppable from him. Obviously, he can play more than that. I think there are going to be some people that very incorrectly walk away from this series saying that he is a melee mid one trick and that's the only thing he can play. I mean, those types of people I don't think have watched Quid for more than just these 5 games. Obviously, we've seen Quid really succeed on a lot more. He barely played these champions last split when he won MVP, but here we are. Like, he is able to play a lot of these melee mids in these matchups where, Smolder is very vulnerable and doesn't really have a lot of tools in the early game if you can get to him before the Ivern does. And Quid, let me tell you, he got to them. Like, phenomenal team fighting, really great target prioritization. He just does so much damage in these team fights on champions that aren't necessarily known for being 1v9 type of carries, but he absolutely was a 1v9 type of carry in this series. I don't want to take everything away from the rest of the team. Ayla in particular, I thought had a great series coming out of the support position. He was by far the better support across these 5 games, and I think he's going to go undervalued for how good he was. Tomo was very good in the back half of this series, even if he struggled to get out of the gate. He wasn't like a star, but he was good enough to be able to conquer his former team once again. River certainly had his problems, but man, if it came down to getting a clutch 50-50 smite at the end of the game, he was going to be able to do that. Dig Baron obviously will strike whenever it needs to. We'll talk about that more when we get into Dignitas, but really if there was one major concern, it was Sniper in the top lane. He once again didn't have a particularly good game on the Renekton. This time though, it wasn't nearly as intrusive. I think games 3 and 4 were definitely a little bit worse from him. This was just a meh game on the Renekton while everybody else was winning, which you will live with. You will happily take that if you're 100 Thieves, but Quid looks like such a generational type of star for this 100T roster. I genuinely don't think that anybody can underestimate him. At this point, he can beat any team in the league 1v9. Like, he is that mechanically talented. He is the kind of player that I think is, in the conversation for top 5 player, like generally in the region, and will be in the MVP conversation for a long time coming. This is another fantastic performance. He has already shown multiple times, like he showed last split, that he is a big series performer, that he doesn't turn off in the playoffs or anything like that. This is another great example of that, and he really showed up when they needed him the most. But this was a Quid win. Do not get it twisted. Alo was really good. Trust me, he was another piece here, but this was Quid really carrying 100 Thieves across the finish line. But for Dig on the other side, It's a really frustrating way for your season to end. It's a bit poetic, I would say, losing to a team like 100 Thieves. These are the two orgs people are talking about. One of them might be going next year in terms of them not locking in their spots for the LCS. I think that there are a lot of thoughts and opinions that will be Dignitas, and unfortunately, if this is their final roster, it went out in probably the most appropriate way it could have possibly ever gone out, which is with a Baron throw. I mean, what else do you even want me to say? Dig Baron is legendary, and it might go down in infamy as the last game Dignitas ever plays. But talking about the rest of the game, Licorice was entirely useless here on the Skarner. He's going to get dud of the game in the top lane. He was awesome throughout a majority of this series, was definitely better than Sniper in the first 4 games, just couldn't quite hold on to that momentum moving into this 5th and final game. Skarner has been rising in popularity, not only now in North America, but everywhere else. NA was just a little bit first to it, but mostly in the jungle. We're really not seeing it a lot in the top lane anymore, and I think this was a good example as to why. Just doesn't really have the combat power to be able to go toe-to-toe with things like Renekton that are very popular right now, and Licorice really just wasn't all that relevant in these team fights with the gold that he was able to generate, and so I am going to call that out, even if I do think he was the best player for Dig across this whole series. You know, Jensen didn't quite step up. A pretty bad game number 5 from him on the Smolder. They put a lot of time and effort in this draft into getting him ahead, and just didn't work, right? You didn't get the stacks, you didn't get Smolder going. If you did get Smolder going, we're talking about a Dig win, but that's not where we were. Jensen wasn't good enough in this game. Spica losing every single smite is definitely an indictment on him. He's never been a particularly good objective controller. This has been a problem for him in the past. I remember this being a huge issue in the TSM days, but, you know, it's something that I do think he can fix moving forward. He just hasn't really shown a propensity to be very good in that phase of the game. I'm a really big fan of Sven. He's the one player on this roster that I think it would be absolutely ludicrous if they didn't have a spot going into next year. He has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is a top 4 AD carry in North America, in my opinion, with that role really struggling right now, but we'll see what ends up happening. You know, Isles wasn't particularly good in this series, but for Dig, this is unfortunately the way 2024 and potentially your LCS tenure ends, and, you know, I think they went out fine. I think getting this big roster, if this is the last time we ever see them finally spending and investing in some names only for them to disappoint, it's probably the most appropriate way for Dignitas to end out their LCS tenure. It just wasn't quite good enough here, and they're going to end in 5th place. But for 100 Thieves, they're moving on now to top 4. We're going to cover their series against Cloud9 later on in the video, but it's time to transition from the lower bracket right up to the winners finals. And move on to winners finals we shall. It's time to get into it. The top 2 teams, the only 2 teams left in the upper bracket here in the LCS, the 2 teams that have already qualified to go to the 2024 World Championships. It's the number 1 seeded Team Liquid taking on the number 3 seeded FlyQuest. And this is not the matchup I think a lot of us were expecting here in winners finals. FlyQuest being able to pull off that upset over Cloud9 was really huge for them. Obviously, not just because they qualified for Worlds, but because I think they proved that they're still a lot closer to being like at the top of the standings than maybe we were giving them credit for. I thought that there was a bit of a gap, and I still think there is a bit of a gap, at least going into this series, from Team Liquid and everybody else, but FlyQuest has certainly shown that they deserve to be treated with a lot more respect than maybe we have treated them. I think some of their losses towards the back half of the regular season, really their loss to Cloud9, put a sour taste in my mouth, but they avenged that in the playoffs, and now they're sitting here in winners finals taking on the aforementioned Team Liquid. But TL just feels pretty unstoppable at the current moment. I think one of the big reasons that I haven't talked about a ton that Team Liquid has just really dominated this split from, like, one of the big reasons why I think they've been able to do that is they just have by far the best meta read of anybody in the LCS. It is clear that they just have a very good understanding of what not only works in the current meta, but what works for them in particular. We've actually seen them be ahead of the curve basically all year long, not only domestically here in the LCS, where they're playing a lot of things that end up becoming pretty common for a lot of other teams, but we've seen LCK and LPL teams kind of pick up their kind of MO coming out of new patches. Obviously, with the LCS often being a patch ahead of a lot of those other regions, we've seen teams just kind of default to what Team Liquid is playing in a lot of these other regions, and that's a really good sign that they have a very good idea of what is good, of what is strong at the current moment, and I think that's helped them out a lot. But don't get it twisted. I'm not trying to take away any of the good stuff that Team Liquid has done from a player perspective throughout this year or from a development perspective. It's not just, oh, we have better drafts, that means we win. These players have been better, and I've talked about it a lot. Impact was my MVP pick. APA was my first team mid laner. Yon was my first team AD carry. You know, I really believe in a lot of the players on this team. I really believe that it's their year to kind of take the reins of the LCS, and their growth has been very real. But how does that match up in particular against FlyQuest? Well, what does Fly Fly do very well. They are able to play for these late game 5v5s incredibly efficiently, and unfortunately, Team Liquid is incredibly good in that phase of the game. In fact, I would argue that that is their most consistent phase of the game. When you're talking about players like APA, and Yawn, you're talking about players that came up through the system as team fighters, as players that were a lot more comfortable there. Obviously more of a snowballer, but is really settled into a tank role on this team. APA and Yawn very much known for their 5v5 ability, and so for Fly, I feel like you're going to have to go a bit out of your own comfort zone in order to do well in a series like this. Perhaps Inspired is going to have to be more aggressive in the early game. Perhaps someone like Quad might be more of a priority and a focal point for some early game aggression from FlyQuest than he typically was in some of these other series, because I do think it's important to play towards the players that you can kind of trust to mechanically outplay some of their opposition. Now, that's not to say Quad is just straight up better than APA or anything like that, but Quad is the one player on this team that I think is a little bit more adept at getting his own leads in 1v1s and actually snowballing games in the early game. So expect that to be a focal point for FlyQuest. That was my identified target at the beginning of this series. But if is able to generate early leads for Team Liquid, I think it's doomed for Fly. Like, generally, I think it's that simple. If Team Liquid is able to win early, I don't really see a way for Fly to come back, even though they are good team fighters, because Team Liquid are just better team fighters. And so, I feel pretty good about Team Liquid being favorites in this series. We'll see if Fly proves me wrong and actually makes this an interesting one. I'm not expecting a particularly close series between these two, but you never really know. So let's jump into whether or not that's going to be the case. Let's find out whether or not it will be close or if it's going to be a blowout like I expect it to be. The only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series, and this was more of the expected outcome. This was a lot closer than maybe I expected this first game to be, but it kind of plays into a lot of the points that I talked about in my preview, where you're looking at both of these teams with relatively similar skill sets. Team Liquid very much kind of focused on these like late game 5v5s. And so when you get this game state where both teams are very much opting into scaling, with the exception of probably the Callista down in the bot lane, then you're entering this game state where it just inherently favors Team Liquid, in my opinion, and more specifically because they are just significantly cleaner in terms of their execution. You're just kind of waiting for FlyQuest to make a grave mistake, and there were quite a few of these. There were 2 players on FlyQuest that certainly did not have ideal performances here in game number 1 that I think held them back, but a player who I think really exceeded in game number 1 was my player of the game, Core JJ, in the support position. Core is one of the best players North America has ever seen. However, I have been on record over the course of this split stating that I think Core is getting more love than maybe he would get in other circumstances if he had a different username, if it wasn't Core JJ, in the support position. I think Yawn has been the more intriguing member of the bot lane 2v2. Core has really adapted his game well. He is somebody who was obviously known for his roaming ability and his, ability to play out the map on engagers, and that was kind of the thing he really got famous for on Gen G, and then, or I guess on Samsung, and then eventually here on Team Liquid in North America. But Yawn is really the kind of player that will just win any 2v2, and that's what's made Team Liquid so difficult to deal with, because APA and and Impact are all such great team fighters, and Yawn is such a dominant laner. It creates kind of this zone where you're not really winning in any phase of the game when you face Team Liquid, and, Core has just kind of been along for the ride a little bit more so than maybe he gets credit for, in my opinion. He was an MVP finalist in this split. I really don't agree with that. I think Yawn definitely deserves that a little bit more than Core. That's just my personal opinion, but I'm certainly not trying to delve into that because of this game. This was a phenomenal Senna performance from him, and I think the reason that is so encouraging is because he's never played Senna before. This is not typically the kind of champion that Core JJ succeeds on or really plays at all. He's not really an enchanter player. He's certainly not someone who likes to play like just this scaling pick that doesn't do much in the early and mid game. His mid game is really where he likes to focus a lot of his attention. He made his name being a mid game monster, and so to have something like Senna that doesn't really have a ton of pressure there, typically you would think that would be taking him out of his comfort zone, but he was perfect. He was clearly very practiced on this champion. Maybe the former AD carry days coming back into play here for him, but just really happy to see him play so well. Maybe a lot of my criticism, quote unquote, it's not even really criticism. It's just like, I think he's slightly overhyped at the moment. Maybe a lot of that is unfair of me to give him. Perhaps you can let me know down in the comments if you agree or disagree with my take on that. But we can talk about the rest of Team Liquid. Impact was a monster in the back half of this game. He did officially get his MVP award. He more than earned it. That was an absolute no-brainer. I'd be shocked if it wasn't almost entirely unanimous. I mean, there was just nobody else that deserved it more than Impact over the course of this split, but he had another really good game here. He mega gapped Whippo on the other side of this, who had a miserable game, which we will get into. T was really solid on the Maokai. This has become a pretty big staple for Team Liquid. APA was good on the Corki. Jan was good on the Callista. Just a good, clean, executed game from Team Liquid. This is what we've become accustomed to when it comes to this team. This is who they are. But for FlyQuest on the other side, man, what happened on the top side of the map? Whippo was a very easy dud of the game here. This was awful. I mean, he was actively running it down for a good portion of this game, just like looking to try and fight at every single opportunity. It was so weird. This is such an anti-Whippo game. I say that, but he's had a couple of these over the course of this split. There haven't really been a lot of top laners that have been all that consistent in the LCS. It's really been Impact and then like a big tier gap and then maybe like Thanatos and then another tier gap for everyone else. Like, it's been a very weird split for top laners in the LCS, but Whippo just continuing to not really find his footing. This was a really awful game one, and I think this is going to hold this team back. If he plays like this, if he's this risky, if he's taking this many like unnecessary risks in the early game, like, it's just doomed for FlyQuest. They can't recover from situations like this. That is compiling onto the fact that Inspired, I thought, played really bad in the back half of this game. Amumu continues to baffle me as this high priority pick, specifically over things like Sejuani. I just don't really understand what he does that Sejuani doesn't do. Maybe Sej is like slightly harder to execute on, but like, I mean, very slightly. Neither champion is difficult. Hell, play Zac for all I care. I just don't think Amumu really does what people want him to do, and he can get himself into some bad situations. But then on top of that, you have Inspired building full MR into Cassante, Corki, Callista, like even the Senna. It's just weird. It's weird decisions that you wouldn't expect a veteran player like Inspired to make. And the problem is, it's not just the build that was the problem. His gameplay in the back half of this game was bad as well, and it sucks because I think a lot of the other players on this team played really well. Busio had a great game on Nautilus. Quad and Masu were doing their jobs. They were not really being problems, and I think if you gave this team slightly more time and some more setup, Azir could carry this. Ezreal could secondary carry this game, and you could be in a really good spot. But the veterans, the imports, the stars of this team in terms of the brand names, they were the ones that let them down here in game number one. But they have chances to bounce back. It's just game number one. If they can get into form, if they can get out of their own heads in terms of overthinking a lot of these decisions, I think they could very much still be in this series. But you cannot take an 0-2 start against Team Liquid. That is disaster incarnate. There is no way you are winning 3 games in a row against a team that is yet to drop 2 games in a row to anybody throughout this year. So a very important game number 2 incoming then, because Team Liquid, I'm sure, wants to take that 2-0 series lead. They want to be able to dominate this series, as they have basically everybody that they played up until this point. If they can win this in convincing fashion, they're going to be going into the finals as the clear-cut favorites without any sort of hesitation. They might already be pretty close to being there, but they want to take that 2-0 series lead. FlyQuest, they have to answer it here if they want to keep their hopes alive. Who's going to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves another series on our hands. The playoffs have certainly delivered a lot more than the regular season so far, and this is just another example. We went in to this series with the expectation that Team Liquid was just going to kind of blow FlyQuest out, or at least that's the expectation I had, and Fly coming out here in game number 2, making it really interesting. They played great in this game, basically across the board. Everybody, I thought, did a really good job, and quite frankly, there were a lot of problems on Team Liquid in this game, a lot of uncharacteristic mistakes from a team that, like I said, is not characteristically inclined to make a lot of mistakes. They've been pretty clinical and pretty clean over the course of this year, even going to some of their harder series internationally. So definitely a weird game from them, very out of character, but we'll talk about that a bit more when we get into them. For FlyQuest, player of the game is pretty obviously, to me, gotta go to Busio. I didn't really think about this much. Like, this was a very easy decision. This was an amazing Renata game for Busio. I'm pretty much all on board with Busio at this point. It's been very cool to see his growth as a player, because very similar to what we talked about with Quid in the previous series for 100 Thieves, I think last year was not entirely indicative of what he could be as a pro. I think playing with Doublelift is always just going to be a bit of a slippery slope in terms of what you're able to accomplish, and Busio, while he was fine last year, he certainly wasn't exceptional. In fact, I was kind of concerned with him coming off of that 100 Thieves year. It felt like he was a bit bit of a Rakan one trick, and that he couldn't really expand his horizons on other champions. He's a good Enchanter player. He's always been a good Enchanter player going back to his time in Academy because he was a mid laner first. But, you know, I wanted to see him be able to produce at a super high level, a world's caliber level, and that's exactly what he's done over the course of this year. I think he's gotten better and better as this year has gone along, and he's grown into being one of the more consistent supports in the entire region. This was a phenomenal performance, and coming off the back of a very good game one on the Nautilus as well, it's just a really encouraging sign. If Busio can keep this up for Fly, if he can continue to be the kind of player that they can play around in the mid to late game, that can be a gigantic playmaker, then that opens up a ton of extra options for a team that at times has struggled with options. And so I think they're really happy to have that. I think Masu was also very good here on the Ezreal, had a lot of things set up for him by Busio and by Inspired, which we will talk about in a second, but Masu definitely doing a very good job and just quite frankly outplaying Yon on the other side of this matchup. Now, how much of that is Yon's doing? We will definitely get into that. This was a very weird game for the Team Liquid bot lane. I want to give another big shout out to Inspired in the jungle. Again, Amumu's not my favorite champion, but when you literally walk up and outsmite for the Baron here, it's very funny, and it completely changes the entire complexion of the game. I think Inspired was very good in some of these fights as well. Amumu does his thing very well. Like, I'm not trying to take away this idea that the thing that Amumu does is valuable. It absolutely is. There is a lot of value to having Amumu on your team purely from the amount that he can create for the rest of your carries. However, I just think that you maybe get a little more of that from other champions, and that's my concern, is like prioritizing Amumu over Sejuani. That's where it starts to get a little bit more like iffy for me, or even prioritizing it over something like Maokai, which we've seen some other teams in this tournament do. That's where it starts to get a little bit more iffy for me personally, but this was another good game from Amumu, and he was very successful over the course of this past weekend, at least in terms of results. And then you've got Bwipo, you've got Quad, they both played well. Quad was pretty good on the Ace-Soul here, taking one of APA's more signature picks away from him. So really nice win for FlyQuest, but the bot lane continuing to deliver, and for Team Liquid, it was kind of the opposite. Really, the worst game that this bot lane has played all year. Like, they've been the best part of Team Liquid for many sections of 2024. When you go back to the regular season in spring, Impact was still playing well, but I went into playoffs saying Yon and Core were the carries of the team, and I think throughout that playoff run, they absolutely were. Yon was the guy that kind of pushed them forward and got them that surprising championship in spring, and then in summer, they've been the best bot lane in North America by a pretty large margin. You know, it's them and Cloud9 that I think, at least in terms of regular season performances, you can put up against each other, but Yon and Core were amazing, especially in the 2v2, and so to see them play so bad in this game, it's just very strange, and this is why I said it's just very out of character. I don't really expect them to have a game like this again. Yon is very easily done of the game. This might be his worst ever game as a pro, or at least as like an LCS pro. I just don't really understand what exactly happened here, how we ended up getting to the spot where he played so poorly. The MF itself as a champion was not very useful. You can't really create a lot of early advantages into Ezreal Renata. You're not really going to be able to win the 2v2 very easily in that matchup. Okay, well, you can be a bullet time in the late game. Well, you've got Namumu, you've got a Renekton diving. I mean, Renata essentially stops that on her own with her ultimate, and so, you know, there's really not a lot MF can do in this game, but still, Yon was a part of the problem. It wasn't just a champion difference. There was some misplays here and there for sure from him. Core wasn't better. You know, definitely got a bit outplayed. Impact had a pretty weak game here on the Cassante. APA wasn't doing anything. This was a bit of a slaughter by FlyQuest. Even so, Team Liquid's macro kept them in this game, and they were down a ridiculous amount of gold, and yet they were still able to control some parts of the map, and that's really a kudos to them, and kind of a bad thing for FlyQuest. It's not really a good sign to be able to say that, but at the end of the day, it didn't really end up mattering. Team Liquid could never win a fight, and so it never ended up turning into anything. But now we're tied up at 1 apiece. Now the series is going into Game 3, and if FlyQuest wins that, then everything is flipped on its head. Now they have full control of the series, and Team Liquid is on the back foot, and we don't really know how they would perform in that situation because they've not been on the back foot. They've not lost 2 games to anybody over the course of this year, but if they're able to pick up the win in Game 3, that sets the course kind of back on to where I think they expected it to be, and it brings them into Game 4 with a lot of momentum. So, who's going to be able to take this middle game of the series? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to go back up in this series 2-1. And this was more of the Team Liquid that I think we have grown accustomed to, the team that we were kind of expecting to show up in this series. This might have not been the most aggressive, dominant game you've ever seen, but this was a macro masterclass, and they played the map incredibly well, something that basically every other North American team just doesn't do at a very high level. Not really a lot of teams in the world really play the map at a high level right now. It's not been something that's been highly prioritized by a lot of teams. Now, the best teams in the world definitely do. You're looking at teams like Gen G, who very famously play the map very well. It's kind of what they're known for, but it's a very difficult thing to pull off in a meta that is very centered around skirmishes and can really be determined by who just wins early. Snowballing is very strong right now, and so playing these slow, more methodical, like macro-oriented games where you're trying to limit as much of the fighting as you can, they can be rather difficult and rather difficult to pull off and win with, especially. And so when you see one, especially from a North American team, it's definitely worth taking note of. For Fly, they just got pulled out of their comfort zone. I honestly don't even blame them entirely. They just couldn't quite keep up with Team Liquid in this one, and that's really kind of the only story for them. Player of the game has to go to APA. This guy alone was 6K up on FlyQuest. I mean, it was genuinely absurd. This is a macro masterclass from APA. It's a masterclass in how to side lane, how to continuously generate gold even without kills. This guy was 0-0-1 until he got a pentakill at the end of the game. Like, that is like, it's the funniest thing you could possibly see. But even when he's 0-0-1, he's up, 4 or 5K gold individually, purely just because of the amount of, standing gold on the map that he was able to take, the CS lead, the towers that he was able to get. Like, he got so much gold funneled into him throughout this game that the pentakill was essentially free for him in the late game, and that's a big plus to APA. Again, this is a player that people were criticizing for being a 1 or a 2 trick, and I get the idea behind that was like, oh, he is, he likes to take towers, he likes to play for the macro game, and he likes to team fight, he likes to play a bit slower. That was always APA's thing with the Ziggs or the ASOL or whatever, right? Scale up, and that was kind of the same thing here on Corki, but this idea that he is not a flexible player that can make it work in multiple different situations, that has to just be gone at this point, because he is clearly very valuable to this team. I think bot lane was way better here in Game 3, just kind of returned to normal. We all knew Game 2 was a complete outlier. I never expected them to have that game again. It's just so strange for them to lose so hard because they haven't really all year long, and so bouncing back to normal was very anticipated here. The Renata was very good. Impact Umpty, I think, played well, but again, this was a team effort, and this was APA generating giant leads on his own and them just utilizing that gold difference, that wallet difference, to end the game. It was really clean, really goal-oriented stuff, I guess you could say, from Team Liquid, and they benefited a lot from it. For Fly, there's really not a lot to talk about from their end. They just got outplayed. Like, this is the difference between a team that really knows what they're doing and, like, just a good team that has good players. I hate to, invoke this comparison, but this very much felt like a classic, like, 2021 T1, like, just beating somebody in the LCK, like, beating a mid-tier team, like an Afrika Freaks in the LCK, and just like, okay, like, the other team's good, they're fine, but T1 just has such a command of the map, and I'm not saying Team Liquid's as good as them, but it's that style of win, and what do you do against that if you're FlyQuest? Like, you don't have the macro. You're not the kind of team that is prepared to be able to take on that kind of team very well, and so you end up just crumbling. Quad was awful in this game. He's going to get dud of the game for me. While he has been really good in this run for FlyQuest, kind of dominated Cloud9 in the previous series, it's been a little bit more up in the air so far at the start of this series, and APA is a little bit of a locked-in player at the current moment, and so picking something like the ASOL and just losing super hard in the early game, again, it's not entirely surprising as long as Team Liquid actually goes out and plays that well, but teams don't often go out and play it well, or nearly as well as what Team Liquid did here, so certainly something to notice. This is the flaw in Amumu. Again, I continue to point to the idea of this champion being a lot better than the actuality of this champion, because there are a lot of flaws in his game plan, and one of those flaws is just, like, what do you do like, level 11 if there's not really skirmishing happening? Like, where do you go? Do you just power farm? Like, what is the usefulness? What is the X factor that you can create? Where can you push the tempo to force the other team to do something? You can't. It's just not really something that he can do, and so, the champion ends up being kind of useless here. Busio, Masu, Bwipo, they couldn't really do anything. Again, there's really not a lot to discuss when it comes to this game, if we're being honest. The only thing to really say is that Team Liquid really played well, and FlyQuest couldn't quite keep up. If they do this once again, the series is going to be over before you know it. And honestly, can you really take that away from Team Liquid? Can you put that out of the realm of possibility for them just to have another game like this? I certainly can't, but we've already seen that FlyQuest can beat Team Liquid, especially if they are able to get those early game leads, if they're able to get one of their priority carries snowballing a bit out of control. They can win another game and send this to a game 5, but they have to do it now. Losing this, of course, doesn't eliminate them from the championship. This is still upper bracket. They would just go down to the semifinals, but I'm sure FlyQuest wants to get into the finals. They want to secure their spot. They want to be the first team to beat Team Liquid in the summer split. To do that, they have to start with game 4. So can they do it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was FlyQuest. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece. And we are going to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5. We're getting a lot of these in today's video. We've gotten a lot of these in the LCS. It always seems to be the 3 series videos that I've only recently started incorporating to the videos that, the video rotations that get these 5-game series back to back to back. It's happened in the NACL. It's happened in the LPL. It's now happening here in the LCS. It's just, I guess you guys have to strap in for the long videos. I'm not complaining. This series is a lot of fun to watch, but FlyQuest did a great job here in game number 4 of just simplifying the process. I mean, again, it's really just about, in this meta, getting your carry fed. If you can do that, you're going to win the game. This was a Sejuani game. Very happy to finally see that over something like the Amumu. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out in this game, so maybe I look like an absolute moron. Who knows? It's up to you to decide as the viewer, but FlyQuest was just in a great position throughout this entire game. Quad was mega fed and was really just able to take over every single fight. There was never a moment where it felt like Team Liquid was ever actually going to be able to win any sort of exchange. They had control of this game for a bit from a macro perspective, and that's very similar to game number 2, where they're really not in any of these games, quote unquote. Like, they're really not, like, in a sense ahead, and they don't have a lot of, like, gold, you know, the things that matter towards trying to win games, but they are so good at the macro part of the game that they're in, like, okay spots. But once again, they throw away a Baron. This time, instead of just Inspired just walking up and smiting it as a Mumu, you actively like lose the Baron in an actual throw here. This makes a lot more sense in terms of the outcome, but it's not ideal. Again, if Team Liquid were more clinical in some of these games, perhaps we're looking at like a 3-0, a 4-0 or something like that, but it's just really hard to talk about that because Fly in the 5v5s was just so much better, even outside of all of that stuff. It's not like Team Liquid had this egregious lead that they just threw away. This was FlyQuest's game to lose, and they didn't lose it. Quad was phenomenal. He's an easy choice for player of the game. He answers APA's pentakill in game number 3 with a pentakill of his own, almost a hexakill in the back half of this game on the Zeri. Yeah, this is how you take over the game on Zeri. We're seeing this champion continue to kind of run things. You know, I'm going to talk about Zeri in a minute when it comes to Team Liquid because I think it's something that they might want to invest in picking. I think right now we're starting to find out some of the problems that Team Liquid has in terms of converting when they are playing these more even game states or when they aren't able to win in the same ways that they were able to in the regular season. But Quad looked awesome here on the Zeri. This is the kind of breakthrough performance you needed to forget about that Aurelion Sol game from game number 3. So really happy for him that it happened. He's had a couple of complete breakaway level performances so far in the playoffs. I want to give a big shout out as well to Bwipo. I thought he had a great game here on the Renekton. It's very strange because you never really know what you're going to get out of Bwipo, but Renekton is that champion where you feel pretty confident that at the very least he's going to be useful, and that's what he was here. He was very, very useful. A couple of great backline flanks in this game to catch out Yan, which were very important, but just generally he's awesome in lane, and he made the Ornn look like a complete wasted pick on the side of Team Liquid. Not easy to do when it's Impact piloting it. Inspired was really good on the Maokai. He was the facilitator for this FlyQuest team, and he filled his role to perfection. Sometimes you can see Maokai be a little bit up and down, especially when you're not, like, running the game in the early game, but he was awesome in this. Like, this is the champion that controls the late game the most by far, and if you're wanting to set up for something like a Zeri in the back half of the game, nobody really does that at the consistency that Maokai does it. Masu, Busio, they were good as well, but this was Quad's game to take over, and that's exactly what he did. Top side of the map is actually what came in clutch for FlyQuest, a really good change of pace for them. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, I don't know what's going on right now, because this, again, they're just weird problems. Yan is going to get done of the game once again here on the Kalista. I'm not out on Yan, and I'm not even really out on Yan's Kalista, but it's very strange how they're not really dominating lane. I want to give a lot of credit to Busio, who I think has been excellent in this series for FlyQuest, in my opinion, which I don't know how popular or unpopular this will be. Busio has been their best player through the first 4 games, and a lot of that is him just shutting down Yan early on and not really allowing him to snowball. And then you're on Kalista from like behind, and not a lot's really going to be happening in those circumstances. Jan is over positioning, getting caught out by Renekton flanks and, you know, things of the sort. And all of a sudden, he's just not very useful. This is where I wanted to bring up things like the Zeri. There's really not a lot of reason for me to believe you can't just pick something like Zeri in the bot lane for Jan. One of the things that they found the most amount of success with in their playoff run last split was just picking the double dragon, you know, the Aurelion Soul plus the Smolder. Obviously, it's a little bit of a different meta right now, but getting a late game scaler, a late game carry for Jan in the bot lane because he is so consistent in these early fights that he's going to be able to survive at the very least any laning phase you throw at him, and then give him something that he can actually play from the later half. It just doesn't seem like TL is going to be able to get those normal gigantic leads that they've been very used to in the 2v2 in the bot lane because of how well Masu and particularly Busio are playing. And so I think you might just want to pivot. I don't think early game Kalista trying to match aggression is really the right idea at the current moment, and it's very much not working out. Not that Core Senna necessarily made it easier. Impact was entirely useless this game on the Ornn, just didn't really get to accomplish anything. Umti didn't really get to do much on the Sejuani. This should be a champion that actually does very well in the early game of this game, and generally you would have expected Team Liquid to pop out to a gigantic early game lead, but it just didn't happen. You live with that. But generally speaking, this was an okay game for Team Liquid. Like, it's not the worst thing in the entire world. You just wanted to see cleaner execution, and you want to see them actively be able to win early. If they can do that, they're going to be able to walk out of this. But this is now incredibly interesting. This is the first time all year, or at least all split, that Team Liquid has lost 2 games in one series. That's not yet happened so far in the summer split in 2024, and so really this is the first time they've been faced with major adversity. We're going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5, and FlyQuest has quite a bit of momentum. If they can get their carries ahead, they're going to be able to walk out of this with a victory, but Team Liquid has the tools they need to stabilize and to win this series after all. But are they going to be able to utilize it, or is FlyQuest going to make a serious dent in the armor of what seemed to be the untouchable team here in North America? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and they will be moving on to our LCS finals, the championship, if you will, and I'm happy for them. Congratulations to them. I think this was a little bit more difficult than maybe they were anticipating. I kind of predict that they came into this series expecting to just dominate it and for it not to be particularly close, but yet here we were with FlyQuest really putting up a great fight in a series like this. But Team Liquid was just better. They were able to get it done in the end, and they are going to be moving on to finals. To FlyQuest's credit, like I said, they were really good, and they're not over. They're not done by losing this. This is still winner's bracket. It's the final winners bracket series, which means they move down now into the semifinals. They will take on the winner of Cloud9 and 100 Thieves, which of course we will talk about next in the video, for a chance to make finals and potentially get their rematch against Team Liquid, but it's not going to happen here. Team Liquid was awesome, and let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's talk about game number 5. Player of the game for game 5 for me is going to go to Jan, the AD carry here. We've been relatively critical, I would say, of his performance over the first couple of games here. You know, in game 2 on the Misfortune, a lot of it was MF just having a really hard time doing anything, but he was the kind of player that put himself into that position. I think it was quite bad in game 4 as well on the Kalista. There were certain moments where I just don't think he was in the right spot, and I think generally speaking he was taken, again, out of his comfort zone by not being able to play the game with a lead and having to play a champion like Kalista from neutral, which just isn't the easiest thing to do in the world. But they took my advice and they drafted scaling in the bot lane here with the Kai'Sa, and lo and behold, he not only survived laning phase, he did very well in the early laning phase, and now he has a champion that actually does have proactivity in the back half of the game, and with that, now he can carry, and now he can become Jan again. So I think it was just course correcting back to some better decisions in terms of their drafting. Not that I think Kalista is like a bad choice or Misfortune is a bad choice by any means. It just wasn't working in this series, and, you know, adapting into something different, I think very much was the right decision here for TL. So Jan getting player of the game in game 5, he was really excellent as the primary damage dealer here for them. But player of the series for me, I am going to very unconvincingly agree with the broadcast and go with Core JJ. I don't really feel like there was a standout like player of the series here for Team Liquid. The player of the series is the decision making. It's the macro for Team Liquid. That's why they won this series. FlyQuest actually was a little bit better in their wins in terms of just the raw fighting and the raw 5v5s. I was more impressed with players like Quad and players like Busio, who I think maybe were like individually some of the better players in this series, but at the end of the day, Team Liquid's macro was so good that they ended up just outpacing pushing and outrunning FlyQuest, being able to generate advantages where Fly couldn't quite answer, and then walking away with a win in this series. But Core was a big reason for that. I think being able to play around his engages, he gets his signature rel here in game number 5, and he executes very well on it. This is what you wanted to see. The only reason that I'm concerned, for giving him Player of the Series, why I'm not quite as enthused as maybe some other people are for Player of the Series, is because I don't think that he was particularly good in lane, which has been a big strength of his over the course of this split in particular. Games 2 and 4 just really weren't all that good from him, and so, it feels weird to give Player of the Series to somebody that I was kind of criticizing in terms of their early game performances, but he was awesome in their wins, and that's more than enough for me to give him Player of the Series. APA was the other player I seriously consider for this, and honestly, I think APA has maybe a slightly better argument in terms of just like the raw talking points, because I think his bad games were just better than Core JJ's. He was more consistent throughout this series. I just don't think his best games were quite as good as Core JJ's. He was just the most consistent member throughout the series for TL, so whichever one you want to value, whether it's game-to-game consistency, whether it's the player who played the best in their wins, like that's up to you, but I think it should go to one of APA or Core JJ for Player of the Series. Impact and Umti were fine, I guess, generally speaking. Not every game was fine from them. There were a couple of performances that weren't great, but they were ultimately inconsequential in comparison to APA getting that pentakill in game 3 and then the bot lane just kind of taking over here in game number 5. So credit to Team Liquid, again, just playing around their superior macro, the ability to outpace everybody at this level, and the fact that they are just like 2 steps ahead of every NA team in terms of the mental. It just gives them such an advantage that other teams just aren't able to actually answer. And then for Fly on the other side, you're probably going to feel bad about this loss because it came so close, but man, they played well here today, so much better than I anticipated them playing. They showed that that win over Cloud9 was most certainly not a fluke. It was not an accident. They are the better team between those two, at least at the current moment, because they showed up against Team Liquid in a way that even Cloud9 didn't really get to do in the back half of the regular season, which is a pretty impressive thing to see. Quad, Busio, they are definitely the standouts for FlyQuest. I think both of them were phenomenal in this series. Busio a little bit more in the early part of this series, and then Quad in the back half. I think were really big moving positive forces for Fly and big reasons why they were in this series. And I think those are the 2 players you're most excited about saying, oh yeah, they did really well. That is a really good thing to be able to see from them. Unfortunately, top side of the map, the veterans, the imports on this team ended up letting them down. Bwipo and Inspired just weren't good enough when it mattered the most. Bwipo's going to get yet another dud of the game here in game 5. The Wukong just wasn't it. I understand that apparently North American teams have been scrimming a lot with Wukong top, and that they really like what it offers in the 5v5s and how consistent it can be at setting up things like Zeri, but it doesn't work out in the early game, and Bwipo was, once again, way too aggressive with a pick that just ended up running it down by the end of the game. It just really wasn't ideal, and Bwipo just gets caught in these situations where, when he can't just raw out-mechanic a lot of the teams that he's going into, like the former macro god, the former shot-calling genius, just is overextended and by himself in a lot of these situations, and I don't really know if that's a Bwipo problem, or if it's a FlyQuest problem, or if it's just even a communication problem. I don't know what the issue is, where the disconnect is, but it is a problem for FlyQuest, because they can't win when Bwipo is constantly getting caught out with all of the gold that he had in this game. Inspired was also just not good enough. He was pretty decent at stealing objectives in their wins, but outside of that, he really didn't do anything. He wasn't a great team fighter in this series, and certainly didn't have a lot of early game pressure, and so you're not feeling entirely enthused about Bwipo and Inspired coming out, but Quad and Busio were so good that it honestly inspires me to feel that FlyQuest has a pretty good shot of getting their rematch with Team Liquid in finals, basically regardless of who they end up running into out of Cloud9 and 100 Thieves. So as weird as it feels, walking out of this series, I feel better about FlyQuest, significantly better. And then for Team Liquid, again, like we said, congratulations to them. They're moving on to the finals. They're moving on to the championships. They are going to be favorites for that. FlyQuest really gave them a good run for their money, and they still underperformed in this series. Team Liquid was not playing up to their expectations, and yet at the end of the day, even with all of that being thrown at them, they still were able to come out on top. They still were able to win it, and that really solidifies my faith that they are clearly the best team in the LCS right now. If the undefeated record didn't sell you on it, this series probably should. But that's going to bring us to our third and final series of the video here, and this is the big one. This is going to determine the final representative from North America at the World Championships in 2024 to join, of course, Team Liquid and FlyQuest, who qualified by making top 3. One of these teams will join them, and one of these teams will have their year ended. There is certainly a favorite going into this series, but as we know in the LCS, anything can happen. It's the number 2 seeded Cloud9 taking on the number 5 seeded 100 Thieves, and Just based off the seeding, you can already tell who the favorite and the underdog in this series is. Cloud9 is coming into this not exactly feeling the best that they've ever felt. They just lost to FlyQuest in a pretty decently sized upset in round number 2 in their first series in the playoffs because they had that bye in round number 1 for being one of the top 2 seeds. This comes off the back of them beating FlyQuest at the end of the regular season. They actually played Team Liquid rather well in the second to last week, and they were undefeated leading into that week. And so Cloud9 had a ton of momentum. It felt like this team had finally figured out some of their late game issues. They were really, really clean in closing out games in the regular season, but at the very least against FlyQuest, a lot of that ended up not being there. A lot of the problems that they had in spring ended up re-emerging, which is entirely concerning because you need to fix those problems. If those are going to be your issues, if you are going to run into these situations where you just can't close games, like that is a debilitating type of problem for a team to have. You can't just overcome that by being ridiculously ahead at this level. Other teams aren't going to give you those kinds of leads. You need to be able to take your gold lead and actively do something with it, which is something this team has really struggled to do. However, the individual play of these players has definitely gotten better over the course of this year. You're looking at players like Berserker and Vulcan who have been significantly better in summer than they were in spring. Vulcan was really starting to concern me with his performances on FlyQuest last year, going into his spring split on Cloud9 where he was a problem, but in my opinion, this seems to be a bit controversial. In the regular season, he was the best support in the region. I think if you're just looking at the 7 best of 3s that they played, he was the best support in North America in the regular season, and you're hoping you can get some of that form, which he did not show at all against FlyQuest. Berserker was really back in form. He wasn't quite the star that he was last year, but he was still really good for Cloud9 in the regular season. You did not get that version of him against FlyQuest. Thanatos was one of the better top laners in the league, one of the 2 top laners that I actually thought was good over the course of this split, of course, alongside Impact, who was better than Thanatos, but the top lane pool has been, remarkably thin, and so you need him to be better than he was against FlyQuest. Blabber, Jojo Pune, who was bad against Fly. Like, there are players here that just have to step up. They have to lock in. They have to play up to their own standard. If this team plays like they did in the regular season, this should not be a particularly close series, but we've seen 100 Thieves make series interesting even when they don't necessarily have the talent on paper to be able to do so. They are constantly overperforming, and right now they've got the hottest player in this series, and that is Quid coming in the mid lane. This guy is on fire. He has been amazing in the playoffs so far and has actively been a hard carry for 100 Thieves. He's a player that is, at this point, kind of known for stepping up in these best of 5s, and there is a real chance that if Quid comes out and is just better than Jojo, which he was in the regular season, that this could be a problem for Cloud9. That being said, that's really the only lane that I'm looking at and saying that 100 Thieves is the favorite in. As much as I like Tomo and Ayla, Berserker and Vulcan were absolutely better in the regular season, and I think Tomo has been an upgrade, but he's not Berserker in terms of the mechanics and what you would expect from him in the 2v2. Thanatos versus Sniper is a disaster matchup right now for 100 Thieves with how Sniper has been playing over the course of this playoff run, getting bodied by Impact, kind of getting bodied by Licorice in the previous series. Thanatos is better than Licorice, or at least he has been over the course of this split. That could be a concerning matchup for 100 Thieves. And I also don't think River is in form at all. He has been significantly worse than he was in spring, and really he didn't prove anything different to me in that series against Dignitas. They won off the back of Quid and Ayla being really good, and so if you're getting these matchups where Sniper and River and even like Tomo and Ayla are struggling, even if Quid is doing well, that could be a scenario in which they just don't have the firepower to be able to win. But again, Quid can 1v9. We've seen that in the past, and if you get one good performance out of one of Sniper, River, Tomo, like one of these players, that could completely change the entire dichotomy of the series. It's not like Cloud9 is known to be perfect in every single game. You have 1 or 2 games where Thanatos or Vulcan or Berserker end up underperforming, or Blabber Jojo, then that could be a huge issue for Cloud9. And so I think this is a very volatile series. Cloud9 are still very much going in as favorites. It would be a pretty gigantic upset if 100 Thieves were to be able to take them down. Cloud9 has been penciled in as a super team from day one, ever since this roster was put together. Even before Thanatos joined the roster, this was a super team, and so if they were to lose this, that would be entirely surprising. But the only way to know who is going to be the final representative for NA at Worlds is to go game by game, and that means starting with game 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 1. They're gonna go up 1-0, and we are already very much into it in this series. This is a big win in game number 1 for 100 Thieves. We talk a lot about establishing momentum and tempo and pressure because I think a lot of those things really matter in League of Legends. Sometimes we kind of take for granted the mental aspect of the game. If you lose game number 1, if you prove that you're kind of beatable, not only does the other team know, okay, we can beat this team if we're on our A game, if they're off their A game, but you as a player, you just went through a big loss on a big stage, and keeping your mental in those situations can sometimes be difficult. We've seen this Cloud9 team already struggle a bit with some mental hurdles. 100 Thieves have very much started off this series with a bang, and we'll have to see how it continues to go along, but this was just a very good, very strong game from 100T. I thought they played it out really well. Player of the game to me is going to go to Ayla in the support position. He was awesome against Dignitas. He had a great series against them and really was the one to separate 100T from Dig in that series, in my opinion. And here, going up against Cloud9, he kicks it off with a bang. We didn't really mention it in the preview, but it's reigniting the Vulcan-Ayla rivalry, which of course was very strong last year. A lot of trash talk between these two players. Ayla kind of getting the better of him in this game. We'll talk about Vulcan, who was really struggling, and that's a problem for Cloud9, but Ayla was excellent. If Tomo and Ayla are going to step up and legitimately be a top 3-ish bot lane in the LCS in a series like this, or even through the rest of this tournament, like, that's a game changer for 100 Thieves, because if you have Quid plus a really good bot lane, it's kind of irrelevant if Sniper and River ever get online, and we'll talk about it. They were good in this game. I'm certainly not trying to, like, undersell what Sniper and River did here in game number 1. They've just been inconsistent throughout this split. To see Tomo and Ayla really step up, Ayla in particular as this big engaged threat on the rel, if that's going to be a problem for Cloud9, that is a dangerous proposition to end up putting forward, as we talked about. Quid continued to look really good here on the Corki. This is the best mid laner in the game. Jojo Pune not picking a particularly good mid laner on the other side of this matchup, and Corki just kind of dismantling it. I know Cloud9's not particularly good at Corki. They showed that off very clearly in the FlyQuest series, but if you don't want to play it, then ban it. Like, truly, that's where I'm at with this champion. I think he's too good to leave up for someone like Quid, who has clearly shown that he can pilot him well. River had one of his better games in a while. Blabber picking Nidalee on the other side of this is completely ego. I just don't like this pick in a pivotal game number 1 to set the tempo. I don't think this is the worst game you can pick Nidalee in, like, in terms of roster construction. You're just kind of pigeonholing yourself in terms of draft, which we, again, we'll talk about when we get to the Cloud9 section, but River was definitely more valuable than Blabber throughout this game. Sniper was much better than Thanatos on the top side. 100 Thieves was just better, I would say, across the board. Ayla was definitely the standout for me, but Quid, River, having really good games as well. They need these players to do well if they want to have any shot of winning, and that's exactly what they did here in game 1. And then for Cloud9, I hate this draft. Like, I may not hate it as much as Reddit, but I'm like halfway there, right? Typically speaking, I'm either like I completely agree or I don't agree. I'm somewhere like with them on this. I hate the idea of this draft. I don't think it's the stupidest thing to do to start off a series, because if you are able to generate this gigantic lead, the problem that Cloud9 has had is just that they're not able to win the game unless they have this absolutely enormous early game lead, unless they're going into the mid to late game with like a genuine like 5, 6, 7k gold lead. And this is the kind of comp that can generate like a 5, 6, 7k gold lead. You just don't really have any other options if that goes wrong, and that was the problem here. It went wrong. Renekton Nidalee is already so volatile in the top lane, and once the Renekton got behind, it was kind of doomed. I think LeBlanc is like super weak in the meta right now. I think that there is genuinely no reason to pick this champion. There are multiple other AP assassins that I think are just simply better at the current moment, and so it very much surprised me to see something like LeBlanc be picked here. I know Jojo is a big fan of the champ, but she's just in a really weak state. She was literally countered by one item on the side of 100 Thieves. Berserker and Vulcan just lost. Like, Berserker, I guess, was generally fine on the MF. He didn't make any major errors. I guess he was deathless in this game, but Vulcan was awful. He's going to get done of the game, just not connected to the rest of the team, bad engages. This was Spring Vulcan all over again, going in way too early, not being on the same page, specifically as Blabber, who he didn't pair up with basically at all throughout this game, and actively making this a harder game to win for Cloud9. I hate to say it, but this team has almost entirely regressed to the spring version of themselves. It felt like we were making so much progress over the course of the summer split. I think part of this is the meta read. I think part of this is understanding, like, like, okay, you just probably shouldn't be drafting LeBlanc and Nidalee and things like that in this meta in game number 1. Meanwhile, 100 Thieves have probably the most meta comp on the other side of this. They played Cassante, Maokai, Corki. They're like literally copying and pasting the LEC and the LCK and the LPL, but that's way better right now than whatever Cloud9 is putting out. And so I understand this idea of bad meta read, but it's a little bit more than that, because even when they had bad drafts in the regular season, they were able to execute the late game on it. They're just not able to do that right now, and that's the most concerning thing. Game 2 is incredibly important for them. Going down 0-2 to 100 Thieves, having to win 3 games in a row with some of the inconsistencies that they've shown, it's just not feasible. They need to win this game number 2, or else it is all hands on deck. For 100 Thieves, if you can get that 2-0 lead, all of a sudden you're actually in a really good spot in this series, and you have a really good chance to be going to Worlds. You are very, very close, and you started this series off on the right foot, but can you keep that momentum up, or is Cloud9 going to be able to wrangle that back and make this a best of 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Cloud9. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece. And we're back. We have calmed the storm. We have very much saved the series here for Cloud9. I think if they would have lost this game too, as I said at the end of the last game, we would have really been in some deep trouble. If you were a Cloud9 fan, or if you were like really expecting them to win, that could have been a huge problem, but they're able to equalize here with, I guess, kind of a standard comp. I mean, this is a pretty LCK draft. Honestly, a lot of people are going to look at this and be like, wow, this is crazy, because I know a lot of people don't watch like the LCK and the LPL. I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm sure a lot of this channel knows that this has been a pretty common matchup. The Nasus into Garen is something that has been generally very common in a lot of regions. Nasus is pretty pick or ban right now. Don't really agree with that kind of priority. I think he's very strong in very specific circumstances, and also, I just can't imagine Garen is like the answer to Nasus. Maybe I'm wrong. Somebody tell me. I get that, like, if you get withered, you just press Q and, like, you're out of it. But, like, is Garen really that great outside of that one interaction? I just don't really understand, like, why this champion is considered the only answer to Nasus. Maybe it's because Chovy did it. Like, maybe that's just it. It's like, oh, Chovy picked it into Showmaker and now everyone's doing it. But you know, it is what it is. Like, the Nasus itself was super valuable in this game, and Jojo Pune is going to get player of the game. I can't really tell. I'm kind of stuck in between two minds when it comes to Nasus. I'm stuck in between the idea that it would be less successful in a region like the LCS because teams can't play around something like Nasus nearly as consistently. Players aren't going to find kind of the opportune angles and timings in order to engage in the same way that they would at the top of the LCK, but I'm also of the mind that it might work better in a region like the LCS because teams aren't quite as adept at just like stopping it from doing its own thing because they don't really know how to play against it nearly as much. Maybe, you know, you guys can let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm always interested to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on that. But at least in this game, yeah, Nasus did the thing. He walked up and he pressed Q on people in the late game and they all died. Like, that's the Nasus thing. If he's able to get in, if you can't just kite him out and just not allow him to get in for free, then he's gonna obliterate you. The only way to really stop him is to burst him down before he has the chance to obliterate your whole team, which is doable, but it's not easy, especially when he is able to get some gold in the early game, when he's got things like Ivern, when he's got things like Gnar and Leona to cause disruption, Kai'Sa that you have to deal with on the back half of a lot of these fights. Nasus's job becomes a lot easier. It's really the Ivern that unlocks Nasus, in my opinion, but you gotta give credit where credit's due. Jojo looking a lot better here in game 2. Boy, do they need this. If he can show up and be better than Quid in any game, I think that's an insta-win for Cloud9. If Jojo plays better than Quid in a game in this series, like, they will win that game. That's just how this is going to go. 100 Thieves do not win when Quid is not winning. It really is that simple to be able to shut down the team. The problem is I don't think Jojo is as good as Quid is right now, and so you're in this situation where you're pulling out the Nasus and hoping that he gets fed. Luckily for them, it ended up working out. I think everybody else in the team also did their jobs. Blabber, Berserker, and Vulcan, I thought all had really good games here. Vulcan with a couple of phenomenal engages on the Leona. Much, much better game here from Vulcan. Much more similar to what we saw in the regular season in terms of aggressiveness and being on time with Blabber, who was really good on the Ivern. I like this Ivern pick for Cloud9 because it just makes things a little bit more simple for them to execute in the later half of the game. It's not the Leona, right? It doesn't limit their options, it expands their options pretty exponentially. Berserker was good. If given the setup, he is often good. He's not the kind of player at this point right now where he's just going to 1v9 games. That's really not who he has been in 2024, but when the rest of the team is doing well, oftentimes Berserker is going to do well. He doesn't really run it down. He's not that kind of player. Thanatos was also much better in game number 2 here, so you're just feeling a lot better. This was a pretty dominant win for Cloud9. They were able to get their lead, and they never really looked back. A pretty important important stop for them here in game 2. But for 100 Thieves on the other side, horrible, horrible game from River. And I know I feel like I'm a River hater. I'm really not. Like, I really don't dislike him individually as a player. I don't think that he's bad by any stretch, but I think people, again, like this is an LCS problem, but I think a lot of people just look at nameplates and assume that players are playing the same that they have in the past year or so. I've seen a lot of that with Core JJ, you know, getting top 3 MVP votes, in my opinion, being a little bit crazy. I've seen that with people like River being considered like top 3 junglers in the LCS this split. I just don't think that's correct. I do not think he has been good, and this was awful. Like, he completely ran it in this game. This was a bad Vi game. He's dud of the game for a very good reason. This is genuinely one of the worst games that River has played. This reminds me so much of, like, end of 2022 Dignitas, like, Golden Guardians River, where he's just actively losing his team games. This was awful, and if he plays like this again, 100 Thieves is doomed. It's unwinnable if their jungler is going to play like this. But the rest of the team didn't exactly help out. I would say River, they didn't make it easier for him, if you will. Sniper continues to not be very good when he has to play from behind. Quid really couldn't do anything on the Garen. Again, this quote-unquote R5 counter pick just doesn't really feel like a counter pick in my eyes. It just feels like a fun interaction for the Garen in the mid lane. Tomo and Ayla weren't particularly interesting. They didn't get to do a whole ton on the Ziggs Nautilus. Overall, this was really just like Cloud9 being better and them playing their own game. And if that happens again, they're going to win this series. This was a good indicator that they absolutely have it in them to run the table in this series, but they have to do it again. You're going into game 3 tied up at 1-1. If you go and drop game number 3 now to 100 Thieves, all of a sudden all that momentum resets and you're on the back foot once again. That would be fantastic for 100 Thieves, especially if someone like River can come out and have a much better game than game number 2. But if Cloud9 can continue to play through the middle of the map, if they can continue to play through Jojo Pume, then they're going to be in a really good spot in this series. It's just really hard for 100 Thieves to win when they don't have pressure in the middle. So the secret has been exposed, the game plan has been settled. Who is going to be able to establish their tempo and their pressure in another 1-1 game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 3 was 100 Thieves. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and we are right back in the position we were in after game number 1. We are in a spot where 100 Thieves controls their own destiny moving forward, and now it's even further along. They are 1 game away from qualifying for Worlds in 2024. This is a team that everybody counted out. Maybe not everybody, but I was way lower on this team. I had them, I think, at number 6 in my power rankings coming into this split, you know, 3rd from the bottom. They were number 6 in my power rankings at the beginning of the year, and here they are, 1 game away from being top 3. This is an immense performance from 100 Thieves, and they played really well in game 3. Cloud9 had opportunities. They were able to generate some gold, but unfortunately, their meta read is just so bad, and the more that they draft themselves into these holes, the more that they draft themselves into these situations where they don't have as many options as the enemy team, the more that they push themselves into a corner, and they can't get themselves out of that corner. It's a continuous problem that just seems to be repeated in perpetuity, forever for Cloud9, and I just can't understand what it is. It's something that has maintained itself through multiple coaching staffs, through multiple iterations of this team. It's been 1.5 years since this team has really found their identity, and they continue to be behind the 8 ball, and that's just not good enough at the current stage of the tournament. If it sounds like I'm frustrated, it's because I am with them. There is no reason for them to be playing the way that they are, and for them to be drafting the way that they are. This team is just not there. I don't know what's happening in scrims, I don't know what's happening in prep, but it's not good enough, and it might cost them the entirety of 2024. 400 Thieves on the other side, though, this is freaking awesome. This is so good from them. They played so much better here in game 3 than they did in game number 2. They still were able to play through the middle of the map. Quid was still good in this game, but I think the most encouraging part is that this really was a spread out team effort. This wasn't just getting Quid ahead in the mid game. This wasn't just Tomo, you know, doing really well in the 2v2 or anything like that. This was very much everybody doing their jobs and everybody kind of holding equal significance towards the success and the victory of the team in this game. So we can go over it here. Player of the game for me, it's gonna go to River. I think you could give this to quite a few people. I think someone like Sniper played really well in this game. Someone like Quid or Tomo or Ayla, like basically anybody on 100 Thieves could theoretically get player of the game here, but I'm gonna give it to River because Maokai's really good. And I know that feels like a bit of a cop-out answer. I don't think River did anything particularly special in a lot of these fights. I do think his timing was excellent, but Maokai does so many things really well. The CC layering ability of that champion is pretty matched, at least in comparison to a lot of the other junglers that are popular in the meta right now. And so when River is able to get these, relatively good game states, and even when he does see a strong LeBlanc on the other side of this matchup, he knows all he has to do is time everything correctly. If he can hit that W, if he can get that lockdown on the LeBlanc, set up for the rest of the team to be able to blow her up, and then you can just win the fight from there, it's as easy as that. It's as simple as can be, and now you've got your series lead. So credit to River. I think the macro was really good from 100 Thieves in this game, but again, like I said, it was everybody on the team. It wasn't one player, it wasn't anybody just overperforming or anything like that. This was just a really good concerted team effort. Sniper was great this game. This is by far the best game that he has played in like the last 3 series. He has really been struggling to maintain any sort of pressure on the top side of the map, specifically in 1v1s, and so to have him come out on the Renekton and actually be very valuable in this game for 100 Thieves, I think was super important. I think someone like Ayla was very active on the map. The Rel continues to be a very, very big pick for basically every team around the world right now, the #1 support in the game by a large margin in terms of performance at the moment. Zeri, Ziggs, like they have their individual strengths. You've got the scaling team fighter in Zeri, you've got the tower taker and the side laner in Ziggs, and both of them played that to perfection, but both were good in other roles as well. It just was a very smart and solid game from 100 Thieves. And there's really not a lot of negatives to say. Again, just really clean team fighting, specifically in the 5v5s. I think that's where they really shined. And then for Cloud9, like, I don't know what to say. Like, this team just continues to have super fixable problems, and it makes you wonder, again, what are we doing? Like, what is happening in between a lot of these games? What is happening during scrim time? What is happening during prep time in the middle of the week? Are we prepping at all? How is LeBlanc so high up on the priority list that we are 2 games into a game, like a season-defining best of 5, and you've picked it twice? This is a champion that has a 0% play rate in any other playoffs anywhere in the world, and you've picked it twice with your season on the line. It's not like JoJo is some LeBlanc maestro. It's not the only champion that he plays. He is more well known on other assassins. It just feels like such a weird thing to gravitate towards, especially because you're drafting it with things like Misfortune and drafting it with things like Ivern. Like, you really want to establish tempo early, but you're going into a meta where anything can really flip at 20 minutes. You win one 5v5 teamfight in the game, completely spirals out of control, and you've set yourself up to not be good at those. I just don't understand it. JoJo is going to get dud of the game. He had a lot of the gold on this team, and he was the one that they were trying to focus on putting in a good position to try to carry, but LeBlanc just doesn't have the tools. It's a mobile, assassin mage in the mid lane, and yet every single fight he was getting locked down by a point-and-click CC from the Maokai and completely obliterated. He was useless in the back half of this game, and I blame it on JoJo. I blame it on whoever is picking him this LeBlanc on R5. It's everyone's fault. Like, it's everyone who had a hand in this decision's fault that this is going so poorly for them. I don't think the rest of this team played particularly better. I think Vulcan is still really struggling. I think Blabber looks relatively useless on the Ivern. Very much a difference from game number 2 in that fact, in my opinion. Ivern is one of those champions that does sometimes look worse when you are playing, with a LeBlanc or something like that instead of a hyper carry in the middle of the map like a Nasus. But generally speaking, this team has to be better. There is no more excuses. They are one game away from not only having their season end, but from missing Worlds. And with a roster like this, if you miss Worlds, if you go down 3-1, especially to a team like 100 Thieves, that is the biggest indictment that you could possibly have. They'll go down in history as one of the most disappointing teams in the history of North American League of Legends, and that would be really a shame. But 100 Thieves has a chance to put that nail in the coffin, to do what was once thought to be unthinkable for them, and make the World Championships, make top 3, make the semifinals of the LCS with this young rookie roster. Are they going to be able to do it, or is Cloud9 going to match all of the series that we've seen up until this point and bring us to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was 100 Thieves. They are going to win game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and some way, somehow, 100 Thieves have officially qualified to represent the LCS at the 2024 World Championships. This feels incredible. It feels insane. It felt impossible, and yet here we are, this band of rookies, this weird outlier of players that have have been put together because other teams just haven't invested as much into players like this. They have come together and become one of the best teams in North America. I've got a lot to say, not only just about 100 Thieves, but about the ecosystem as a whole, because this victory to me is really a sign that the orgs that are investing into North American players and into North American talent continue to reap the benefits. Meanwhile, everybody else continues to struggle. It's really unfortunate that it comes at the expense of Cloud9, because I would argue that for the most part that they have done that over the course of their lifespan, but this is not the roster that they have done that with. Jojo, Pune, and Blabber and Vulcan, like, yes, they're endemic NA players, and Jojo very much is a product of the system. Not that Blabber and Vulcan aren't, just that Jojo is a much more recent, product of the system. But 100 Thieves being a team that went out and collected these players, that picked up players like Tomo and like Ayla and like Quid, and Sniper was a high valued prospect, but to pick up these players that didn't necessarily have the same kind of capital as like the top prospects, and for them to come in and still be like a world's caliber team, it is immense. And you know what, I'll just make the point now, before we even get into the conversation for game number 4, I want to talk holistically about Worlds. Let me run down some names of some players that are qualifying to Worlds from North America. APA, Yawn, we've got Quad, who just came up from the NACL, Masu, Busio, Sniper, Tomo, Ayla. These are all NA products. Like, obviously, Quid and, Quad, funnily enough, they are on the bubble of that. They both played in the system. Quid obviously wasn't a starter in the LCK. Quad was a starter in the LCK, but had to go through the NACL. Even if you don't include them, APA, Yawn, Masu, Busio, Sniper, Tomo, Ayla, these are all players that came through the NA system that weren't considered, like, no-brainers. Maybe someone like Masu was considered a no-brainer, but everybody else there had haters, they had doubters, and all of them are showing that they can be at the top of their position. You know who's not going to Worlds? Teams like Cloud9, teams like Dignitas, these, even organizations like Immortals and like Energy that have not really spent the time to invest in some of the new young NA talent that is coming through the ecosystem. As somebody who covers the NACL, it is so rewarding to see what I've been talking about play out in reality in the LCS. The orgs, the 3 orgs that have actively invested into trying to make the ecosystem better by promoting players this year in Team Liquid, in FlyQuest, the 2 teams, by the way, with NACL teams, still, like, actual affiliate challengers teams, and 100 Thieves, who is known for their development and has a roster full of rookies, players like Sniper, and I guess he was really the only rookie, quote-unquote, coming into the year with Meech being replaced, but Tomo getting a real fair shot here, Ayla getting a real fair shot here, Quid getting a full year of a shot here. Like, these are the orgs that you want to see succeed. You want to see the teams that invest in North American talent make it work. And again, maybe I'm just like talking out of my ass on this one. Maybe you can point to the fact that, oh, you're leaving out some pretty important pieces, like River going to Worlds from 100 Thieves. You have players like Bwipo and Inspired going to Worlds from FlyQuest. You have someone like Impact going to Worlds from Team Liquid. And yes, all of that is real. You have veterans on these teams, but what has been proven over and over again is that the combination, the magic combination to get a team that actively can overachieve and reach their goals in the LCS is to take 3 really talented rookies or so and pair them up with veterans that can ease that transition. Full rookie teams really struggle because they don't have that knowledge and experience to guide them through the rough patches. Full veteran teams like Dignitas that haven't really played together for a long time and aren't necessarily superstars at their position, don't have the upside to potentially break through the glass ceiling. This is how you do it. I want to give so much credit to 100 Thieves as an organization, to the people who make the decisions behind the scenes, to people like Jungle Juice that have been able to really craft a roster and an ecosystem that works for them, to coaches like Golden Glue that have been able to get the most out of these players, and obviously I want to give a big shout out to the players themselves. It's all well and good to be given an opportunity on this kind of stage, but to make the most of it in the way that they have, it's ridiculous. Tomo's going to Worlds and he barely played in the summer split, and he more than deserves it. This is somebody that was left out of these rosters for what essentially seemed like no reason after being so good for Dignitas in the spring split. It's amazing to watch what happened, but again, I didn't want to go on that tangent super early on. I know this section's already a bit long, so I guess I'll try to cut down some of the conversation on game number 4. I just think it's an important thing to talk about. The talent is good enough here in NA to make it work. The talent is good enough in North America, in the NACL, to be able to win the league, to make a statement in North America. You just have to utilize it, and these teams very much did. But going into conversations about game number 4, player of the game is going to go to Tomo on the Kai'Sa. This was a dominating performance. He was better than Berserker for a lot of this series. Now, Berserker was on the Ziggs here in game 4. How much do I think, like, oh, Berserker was bad? I don't think he was bad. I think in, like, 3 games total here, I don't remember what he had in game number 2, but he must have only had, like, 1 or 2 deaths throughout this entire series. I mean, he only had 1 death in their losses combined. Like, Berserker was just unkillable, but he was also kind of useless through a lot of these games, and Tomo was very useful in this series. He has been a huge upgrade to this team because of his aggressive nature, his ability to win 2v2, which a lot of bot laners here in the LCS can't really do, and I'm really excited to see what he's going to do on the international stage. This is somebody who was fighting for like 5th or 6th place in the NACL like a month and a half ago, and now he's going to Worlds. It's really, really cool to see. But player of the series as a whole for me, this one's a no-brainer. It's gotta go to Ayla. This was a phenomenal series from Ayla. I think people are going to overlook him because it seems like they always do. I've definitely always been an Ayla defender, and he's really made it worthwhile here. I know the Vulcan-Ayla rivalry isn't quite as strong as it was last year, but for Ayla to be the one to knock Vulcan out of Worlds, certainly a bit of a storyline there, and Ayla was phenomenal in this series as an engage threat, as a go button for 100 Thieves, and generally just as a macro presence. This was genuinely a defining series, in my opinion, for a player like Ayla, who we've been waiting to see that breakout on. I think River was pretty good. I certainly don't think he deserved the player of the series that they gave him on broadcast. Like, he was really, really solid, but bot lane was definitely the standout lane in this game for me, and, you know, a lot of the jobs that he did really well, I think were set up because the rest of the team was doing really well. Again, call me a River hater. It's up to you to really determine your, you know, opinion on that. You guys know where I stand when it comes to River, but this was definitely the best of 5 that he has played in quite a long time. Quid is a star, like a genuine superstar here in the LCS, and that's really what's pushed 100 Thieves over the edge, especially on things like Yone and Yasuo. And Sniper played his best of 5, I would say, of the playoffs, maybe with the exception of that Dignitas matchup in round number 1. Everything came together for 100 Thieves, and they're reaping the reward now. But for Cloud9, you know, like, what do you even want me to say? We all kind of saw this coming. Like, I hate to say that. This was kind of on the table when they lost to FlyQuest. It was like, oh, it's going to be that kind of collapse, because this is just what happens to super teams in the LCS, whether it's FlyQuest last year, whether it's 2022 Team Liquid, whether it's like, what, I think it was 18 TSM, the one with Mike Young, that didn't even end up making finals. Like, there are so many cases of super teams just not working out. I think really the only case of a super team actually working in LCS history, and correct me if I'm wrong, I could just be missing a team, but the only case I can remember is 2018 Team Liquid, you know, the double lift, like Pobelter, Impact, Xmithy team on Team Liquid when he first joined. That's really the only thing I can remember that was a success in terms of like super teams in North America. Outside of that, it just hasn't really worked out for a lot of these teams. It's never really been one of those situations where they've actually been able to make it work. You know, Team Liquid in 2022 is the most comparable, I think, to what Cloud9 was this year, and in a very similar way, it just was a mesh of styles that didn't end up working out. You had players like Jojo Pune, who had the worst year of his entire career here, in my opinion, and certainly the worst split in summer. He's going to get dead of the game in Game 4. He was an albatross throughout their entire playoff run. He was the worst player on this team in the regular season as well. I do want to corral some of the narrative because I have been seeing things like, turns out Jojo Pune was a bust. You're absolutely ludicrous if you think that. This guy's already an LCS champion and an LCS MVP. I have a feeling he's going to be fine moving forward, but this was not the team to get the most out of him. You had players like Berserker and Vulcan that just couldn't figure out how to play as a duo, and the questions about Vulcan very much still remain. Individually, Thanatos, a lot of the growth that he showed over the course of the regular season that I praised him for in my playoff primer video, it all disappeared in the playoffs when it mattered the most. His late games are still horrendous, and all of the concerns I had when they signed him him, they're still real. Again, I got a lot of pushback for saying that Thanatos was a player that I just wasn't particularly high on as a prospect. I was high on him as a prospect, but just not in the same way that, like, this wasn't a can't miss guy. I had him as my number 2 LCK Challengers League top laner last year, behind Perfect, who is starting for KT Rolster, and he played exactly as I anticipated him to. Incredibly mechanically talented, very good in lane, no brain, no macro. Like, it doesn't have that part of the game down. He just doesn't, and that really shined in the playoffs in a bad way. And Blabber, like, this guy continues to have some ups and downs. Like, I don't even really know what to say about Cloud9 anymore. This is a team that has failed to address their primary issues over and over again, and as a result of that, they are going to miss Worlds. They have no one to blame but themselves, and we'll see what they do going into the offseason. I can't imagine this organization is happy, but at the same time, another note I want to make, and I always say this when it comes to super teams, do not flame the org for trying to put together a team that can win. I think that is the stupidest thing that you can do as a fan. We are dying in the LCS for these teams to try, for orgs like Dignitas or Immortals or Shopify Rebellion to actually go out and try to put a team on the Rift that can win. And Cloud9 went out and tried to do that. It just didn't work out. I'm not yelling at the org for making the decisions they've made. I'm sure if they could do it over again, they would. They would do it again, because on paper, this shouldn't have gone the way that it did, but games aren't played on paper, unfortunately, and it's not about, you know, did they make the right or the wrong decision at the time. It's what do they do from here? What direction do they think it's the best to go in? Who are the core players that they want to keep around, and who is going to be moving on going into 2025? Those are the real questions, but once again, congratulations to 100 Thieves. This org has more than deserved all of the flowers I'm giving them in this segment. They are truly a showcase of what you can do when you invest into players in North America. Sniper, kind of a homegrown talent. Someone like, you know, Ayla's very much been a part of, like, the NA ecosystem forever. Tomo's been a part of the ecosystem forever. You know, River and Quid are imports, but, you know, Quid never got a chance over in the LCK. This is his first opportunity, and he's made the most of it. This team stuck with him after a really rough rookie year, and it really paid off. I have nothing but good things to say about 100 Thieves, and honestly, I'm really hopeful that they can even do more as we go into the semifinals. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS round number 3 overview and analysis video. Only 3 teams remain in the LCS Championship, the 3 teams that will be representing the LCS at Worlds. Team Liquid, being in the finals, has already locked that they will be either the number 1 or the number 2 seed, depending on whether or not they win the finals. That means that they have made the Swiss stage of the World Championships. Congratulations to them. I don't think anybody's particularly surprised by that, but I'm sure they're happy to have it. FlyQuest and 100 Thieves are going to fight it out in the semifinals, not only for a chance to make the finals, but of course, to see who gets to join them in the Swiss stage. Of course, only the top 2 seeds from NA are immediately slotted into the Swiss stage. The 3rd seed will have to go through the play-ins, although with the draw already happening, the draw is very favorable to the North American team, and so they very likely will be able to get out rather easy, and also the play-ins are very easy to get out of. 4 of the teams get out, and there are only 2 major region teams in it, so it would be a pretty big travesty if one of the teams ended up missing it, so play-ins might actually be even more advantageous than they normally have been this year, but you still want to be able to make that final. And as for the matchup between FlyQuest and 100 Thieves, honestly, this is kind of interesting on paper. When you look at the individual matchups, it's not all that far-fetched to say that 100 Thieves might have a chance. Quid versus Quad didn't exactly go in 100 Thieves' favor the last time they played, and that is pretty consequential towards the success of a team like 100 Thieves. If Quid is the best player on the Rift, which I'm going to be honest is certainly not out of the realm of possibility, I think 100 Thieves can win, but I'm going to default to what we saw in the regular season, which is that Quad is certainly good enough in the 1v1 to isolate some of Quid's mechanical advantages, and the rest of FlyQuest is probably better across the board. They probably have a better bot lane. They certainly have a better top side, at least when they're actively playing well. I trust Inspired more than I trust River at the current moment, so I'm predicting FlyQuest to get their rematch with Team Liquid, especially after they looked so good in that series against TL, but let me know if you agree or disagree with that down in the comments section below. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're not only posting about the LCS, of course, we will cover the rest of this tournament, but LCK is still very much going on. We just posted the end of the LPL and the LEC last night. You can check out those videos. If you're interested in the NACL, is also wrapping up their playoffs very soon. The videos on that will be out later this week. So if you're interested interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all